The Pacific sky was black with smoke. The ocean shimmered with fire. Battleships lay broken, steel giants gutted by flame. The air stank of fuel and death. On the horizon, one carrier, USS Enterprise, raced home through open waters, her decks empty, her planes scattered, her crew staring into the distance where their world was collapsing. Enterprise had missed the attack by mere hours. She was spared, not by strength, but by chance. And in that chance lay the seed of something extraordinary. Within weeks, America's Pacific Fleet would be in ruins. But one ship, one gray, scarred, relentless ship, would refuse to die. She would carry the war on her back across every ocean. She would become a legend whispered by both sides. The Japanese called her the Gray Ghost. The Americans called her simply Enterprise. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, she would fight more battles, survive more hits, and destroy more enemies than any warship in American history. This is her story. The story of the ship that changed the Pacific War. The United States Navy was reeling. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered American naval power overnight. Battleships, once the pride of the fleet, lay at the bottom of the harbor, twisted and burning. The Pacific was now Japan's domain. In those early months, Japan's navy was unstoppable. Their carrier force, 6 fast, deadly ships under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, struck with terrifying precision. From the Philippines to Wake Island, from Singapore to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun advanced unchecked. But there was one American carrier still operational, still capable of fighting back. The USS Enterprise CV-6. Launched in 1936 as part of the Yorktown class, Enterprise was not the largest ship afloat. Her steel hull stretched 800 feet, carrying 90 aircraft and a crew of more than 2,000 men. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in endurance, a design that would soon be tested beyond imagination. When war broke out, Enterprise was under the command of Captain George D. Murray. Her air group, trained relentlessly before the war, included dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. Among her pilots were men who would become legends: Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Lieutenant Dick Best, and dozens of young aviators barely in their 20s. Within days of Pearl Harbor, Enterprise was ordered into constant motion, searching for the Japanese fleet, escorting convoys, launching raids. The first American strikes on Japanese-held islands came from her decks. Her aircraft bombed Kwajalein, Watjay, and Malalap, not decisive victories, but proof that America could still strike back. The crew worked around the clock. They slept in hammocks slung beside ammunition racks, ate cold rations in the shadow of anti-aircraft guns, and patched bullet holes with scrap metal. Each day they expected to meet the enemy, and each day they did not. Their resolve only hardened. By April 1942, Enterprise joined USS Hornet for a mission that defied logic, the Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 bombers, too large for carriers, were lashed to Hornet's deck. Enterprise escorted her across 600 miles of open Pacific waters, through rain and fog, toward Japan itself. On April 18, 1942, the bombers took off. Their target, Tokyo. It was a symbolic strike, militarily minor, but psychologically massive. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard American engines over their cities. For the first time, the myth of invincibility cracked. Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor to cheers, but there was no rest. Intelligence reports warned that Japan was preparing another major operation, one that could crush what remained of the Pacific Fleet. The next confrontation would decide control of the ocean. The stage was set, Battle of Midway, a battle where Enterprise would stand at the center of history. But before that moment, her crew had to learn a new truth. In this new kind of war, survival depended not on armor or guns, but on courage, precision, and timing. Enterprise had all three. American codebreakers had done the impossible. They had cracked Japan's secret naval codes and discovered the target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral in the central Pacific. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz knew this was Japan's next objective, a trap designed to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers. But this time, the United States would spring the trap first. 3 carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, formed the core of Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Against them, Admiral Nagumo commanded 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The Japanese were confident. Their carrier air crews were elite, their coordination flawless. Their plan was to lure the Americans out and crush them in a single blow. But Enterprise was waiting. Her pilots, many of whom had trained under brutal conditions in the months since Pearl Harbor, now prepared for the most important battle of their lives. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft launched from Nagumo's carriers and struck Midway. The island burned, but its defenses held. American bombers from Midway responded, attacking the Japanese fleet, but scoring no hits. Still, they forced Nagumo to delay, a fatal hesitation. Back aboard Enterprise, Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey received new orders, find the Japanese fleet and attack. But there was a problem. The enemy's position had shifted. The coordinates were wrong. Fuel was running low. Pilots searched the empty sea hour after hour, scanning for any sign of the enemy. McCluskey made a decision that would alter history. Instead of turning back, he expanded his search pattern, pushing further north and east. His crews knew what that meant. They might not have enough fuel to return, but they followed him without hesitation. At 0955 hours, one of his pilots spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding northeast. The Arashi. McCluskey understood instantly. The destroyer was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He turned his formation to follow. At 1000 hours, the ocean below came alive. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes littered the decks. Fuel hoses snaked across the planking. They were at their most vulnerable. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He split his force. 17 dive bombers would attack Kaga, and 16 would strike Akagi. From 14,000 feet, the Enterprise bombers rolled into their dives. Japanese lookouts screamed warnings, but it was too late. The Zero fighters were at low altitude, having just finished off the earlier Midway attackers. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, but they couldn't track the bombers plunging vertically at over 300 miles per hour. The sky filled with shrieking engines and black bursts of flak. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships, then another, then another. Each hit found a deck loaded with fuel, munitions, and armed aircraft. Fire erupted instantly. Explosions tore through her hangars. Within minutes, Kaga was a firestorm. Akagi took only 1 direct hit, but it was enough. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading a 3-plane section, dropped his 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck midships. It detonated in the hangar among fueled aircraft, igniting an inferno that roared through the ship. By afternoon, Akagi, the flagship of Japan's first air fleet, was a burning wreck. Meanwhile, Yorktown's dive bombers struck Soryu. 3 direct hits turned her into another blazing ruin. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were doomed. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Only Hiryu remained, and she struck back savagely, crippling Yorktown. But the U.S. counterattack, again led by Enterprise bombers, found her hours later. 4 direct hits sealed her fate. By the next morning, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. Enterprise's pilots and McCluskey's single decision to keep searching had changed the course of the war. The Battle of Midway was over. The tide in the Pacific had turned. But for Enterprise, it was only the beginning. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, was more than just a ship. She was an organism, alive with the rhythm of war, her heart beating with the pulse of 2,200 men who served aboard her. To understand why she became the most dangerous American warship of World War II, we must look beyond her victories. We must understand how and why she kept winning when every other ship around her fell. Let's explore the angles, the human, the tactical, the technological, and the psychological that forged her legend. The Enterprise's true armor wasn't steel. It was the will of her crew. From the chaos of Pearl Harbor to the inferno of Santa Cruz, the men aboard the Big E developed a shared belief that their ship could not die. They called her the Gray Ghost. Japanese radio reports claimed her sunk 3 times, yet she always returned. Behind that myth was a truth of blood and fire. At Guadalcanal, Enterprise was bombed 5 times. One explosion ripped open her flight deck. Yet within hours, damage control teams, guided by Lieutenant Commander Herschel Speed Smith, a quiet, methodical engineer, were cutting steel, welding plates, fighting fires, and keeping her afloat. Smith never became famous. His name barely appears in official Navy reports. But his systems for emergency patching, his reorganization of repair crews into firefighting and rearmament units, became models for the entire Pacific Fleet. Enterprise didn't survive because of luck. She survived because her men refused to accept the idea of losing her. Below deck, carpenters became medics. Pilots became loaders. Engineers manned anti-aircraft guns. Every man aboard knew if Enterprise died, America's fight in the Pacific might die with her. That human spirit, defiant, exhausted, fearless, became the ship's soul. Enterprise wasn't just a ship that fought hard. She fought smart. Her commanders, from Admiral Spruance to Captain Arthur C. Davis, understood that tactics in carrier warfare were evolving faster than the manuals could be written. The Enterprise pioneered what came to be called the 360 defense, an overlapping zone of anti-aircraft and fighter coverage that allowed her to survive Japanese dive bomber waves. Instead of relying on static gun arcs, Enterprise coordinated fire control between ships and air patrols in real time, using radar guidance and early warning relays. Her Combat Information Center, CIC, a cramped, dimly lit room deep inside the ship, was one of the first true examples of networked warfare. Operators tracked blitz on glowing radar scopes, communicated vector data to airborne fighters, and issued course changes to the fleet. It was primitive by today's standards, but revolutionary in 1942. When Japanese squadrons approached, Enterprise already knew their direction, altitude, and numbers before they even sighted her. That advantage meant seconds, but in carrier warfare, seconds were survival. In battle after battle, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Philippine Sea, this tactical intelligence gave Enterprise's fighters the edge. Enterprise was learning, evolving, a living system of men and machines adapting faster than its enemies could comprehend. She was a Yorktown-class carrier, fast, maneuverable, armed with 5-inch guns and bristling with anti-aircraft batteries. But what made Enterprise unique wasn't her specifications. It was how those specifications were pushed to their absolute limits. Her flight deck, originally designed for slower, lighter aircraft, was modified repeatedly. Reinforced plates were welded by onboard engineers to handle the stress of launching heavier planes like the TBF Avenger and F-6F Hellcat. Her radar systems were constantly upgraded, from the primitive CXAM-1 to the far more advanced SK and SG sets, turning Enterprise into a floating sensor hub capable of tracking enemy planes hundreds of miles away. Her communication systems were rewired mid-war to enable simultaneous coordination of air groups over multiple targets. Even her hangars were redesigned while she was in combat zones. The Construction Battalion, CBs, literally cutting and welding under fire at Guadalcanal, modifying elevators and storage bays so that planes could be armed and launched faster. Enterprise wasn't just being maintained. She was being rebuilt in motion. Each battle changed her. Each repair made her more efficient, more lethal. By 1944, she could launch, recover, refuel, and rearm aircraft faster than any other carrier in the Pacific. An innovation born not in design bureaus, but in the chaos of battle. The Japanese began to fear her name. Intercepted radio traffic often mentioned the ship that won't die. Pilots reported seeing Enterprise again, though by their reports she should have been sunk. It wasn't superstition, it was psychological warfare. Japanese strategists couldn't understand why Enterprise kept returning. Their doctrine assumed that once a carrier was hit, it was out for months. American doctrine, built around repair, not replacement, shattered that logic. Enterprise became more than a ship. She became a symbol of inevitability, and symbols can be deadlier than bombs. For American sailors, she was hope. For Japanese crews, she was dread. And in war, morale decides battles as surely as bullets. Enterprise's presence in any fleet action boosted confidence across the Pacific. To the men on the line, she was proof that the U.S. Navy was still coming, no matter the cost. That fear, that ghostly persistence, made her the most psychologically dominant weapon in the Pacific theater. The Enterprise wasn't built to inspire mythology, but by 1943, she had become it, a ghost that haunted the Imperial Japanese Navy across every ocean. And soon, she would face her most desperate test yet, when she fought not just against the enemy, but against her own destruction. No warship survives by luck. It survives because of leadership, the kind that doesn't command from behind, but stands on the bridge under fire. The USS Enterprise had such leaders. Men who refused to abandon her even when she was burning, leaking, and dead in the water. One of them was Captain Osborne Hardison. In late 1942, during the darkest months of the Pacific War, Enterprise had been bombed, battered, and declared out of action. Yet Hardison, against every recommendation, took her back into battle. His reasoning was simple. If we don't go, no one can. Hardison wasn't reckless. He was resolute. He trusted his engineers, his pilots, his damage control teams. Under his command, Enterprise fought through the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, where she took 2 direct bomb hits and lost 44 men. But she survived. Again. Hardison's leadership became a model for carrier captains across the Navy. He taught them that carriers weren't fragile instruments of strategy. They were fortresses of endurance. Then there was Herschel Speed Smith, the man who kept her alive. Smith wasn't a captain or an admiral. He was a damage control officer. But to those aboard Enterprise, he was a savior. He trained his teams to think fast, act faster, and never wait for orders. His doctrine, isolate the fire, vent the deck, reinforce the frame, became the Navy's Bible for survival. And above them, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the calmest commanders in naval history, understood Enterprise's true value. While others saw her as one ship among many, Spruance saw her as the center of gravity, the soul of the Pacific Fleet. When she entered a battle group, the men knew the fight was serious, and when she was damaged, Spruance demanded she be repaired first. His words after Santa Cruz summed up her legacy. Without the Enterprise, we would have no fleet left in the Pacific. Leadership made her indestructible. Strategy made her immortal. Enterprise wasn't just a warrior. She was the fulcrum upon which the entire Pacific War turned. From the Battle of Midway to Leyte Gulf, she was present in nearly every major naval engagement. 18 out of the 22 carrier battles fought by the United States. At Midway, her pilots, led by Wade McCluskey, made the fateful decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, uncovering the entire enemy carrier fleet. That one act, a judgment call under pressure, led to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers and forever shifted the balance of the Pacific War. That single moment, June 4th, 1942, at 10 a.m., marked the beginning of Japan's retreat. And at the heart of that turning point was Enterprise. Her dive bombers destroyed Kaga and Akagi. Her aircraft wiped out the veteran pilots who had once attacked Pearl Harbor. From that day onward, Japan's naval air power began to bleed out. In later years, Enterprise became the backbone of every offensive thrust. Guadalcanal, where she provided air cover for the Marines trapped on Henderson Field. Eastern Solomons, where she sank the Japanese light carrier Ryujo. Philippine Sea, where her pilots helped shoot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Everywhere the Pacific Fleet advanced, Enterprise led. The Japanese learned to identify her by her silhouette. Her blackened deck, scarred hull, and smoke-streaked tower were unmistakable. Her presence on the horizon meant one thing: the Americans had come to finish it. Enterprise became the strategic constant, the ship that linked every victory. When the U.S. Navy finally reached Okinawa in 1945, she was still there, scarred, patched, and weary, but still launching aircraft. But behind the legend was a brutal reality. Enterprise's endurance came with a cost. More than 400 men killed, hundreds more wounded, and thousands scarred for life. Her decks were slick with blood after every battle. Her hangars reeked of smoke, oil, and burnt aluminum. Pilots returned from missions trembling, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Every landing on her deck was a gamble. Every launch was a prayer. Her crew didn't call her the Gray Ghost because of luck. They called her that because she carried ghosts of her own. After the Battle of Santa Cruz, when Enterprise limped home, sailors painted a message across her island tower: Enterprise versus Japan. It wasn't arrogance. It was grim truth. By that point, she was the only operational U.S. carrier in the Pacific. If she had gone down, the Japanese would have regained air superiority, and the entire Guadalcanal campaign might have collapsed. Every man aboard knew that, and yet they volunteered. They kept flying. They kept patching steel, hauling bombs, and refueling planes on a deck still warm from explosions. Enterprise wasn't just fighting for victory. She was fighting for survival. Her story is not just about power or tactics. It's about human endurance in the face of annihilation. By the end of 1944, Enterprise had become more than a ship. She had become the embodiment of America's resilience. In every Navy recruitment poster, In every war bond campaign, her name appeared. The word Enterprise came to mean innovation, courage, and persistence. The Japanese never sank her, but peace did. When the war ended, Enterprise was scrapped in 1960. A bureaucratic decision, cold, efficient, indifferent. Yet her spirit lived on. Her name was reborn in USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and soon, CVN-80, now under construction. No other name in naval history carries such weight. The gray ghost will rise again, and in every steel plate welded, in every deckhand who looks to the horizon, the story of the ship that refused to die endures. Enterprise had survived the unthinkable, but her greatest battles and her final heartbreak still awaited her. Her destruction would not come from bombs or torpedoes, but from something far quieter and far more human. It was October 26, 1942. The Solomon Sea, a stretch of tropical blue, was about to become the graveyard of men and machines. At dawn, the USS Enterprise was sailing east of the Solomon Islands. Her decks were alive, mechanics loading bombs, armorers fitting machine guns, pilots checking their cockpits. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and tension. Admiral Kinkaid knew the Japanese were coming. Two powerful enemy carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were closing in, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Enterprise stood almost alone. Her sister carrier Hornet was nearby, but soon she would burn. At 0620, the first radar contact appeared, a faint echo miles out. Within minutes, the ship's loudspeakers erupted. Enemy aircraft incoming, distance 75 miles. Sirens wailed. Sailors ran to stations. The flight deck cleared. Gunners gripped their triggers. From the east, the sky darkened with specks. Dozens of Aichi D-3A dive bombers and Nakajima torpedo planes, screaming in formation. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands had begun. Enterprise's fighters, F-4F Wildcats, launched to intercept, climbing into the sun. In seconds, chaos consumed the skies. Tracer fire stitched the clouds. Planes burst into flame. The sea below churned with splashes and debris. But the Japanese kept coming. At 0710, the first bomb hit. It smashed through the flight deck near the forward elevator, detonating deep inside the hangar. The blast ripped apart aircraft and men alike, showering the deck in molten steel. A second bomb followed minutes later, hitting amidships. Fire spread through fuel lines. Smoke poured from the island tower. Enterprise shuddered. Electric power flickered. Steering jammed. Captain Osborne Hardison, still on the bridge, refused to flinch. "Keep her steady," he ordered. "We fight her, not leave her." Below deck, Herschel Speed Smith and his damage control crews fought like demons. They crawled through smoke-filled compartments, sealing ruptures, cutting through warped steel, dragging the wounded out. One sailor later recalled, "It wasn't hell below decks. Hell would have been cooler." By 9 o'clock, the ship was bleeding. Dozens dead, dozens more missing. But she was still afloat, still launching planes. Above her, the air battle raged. Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, struck back. They found Shokaku and Zuikaku, hammering them with bomb after bomb. Shokaku took 3 direct hits, burning so fiercely she had to withdraw. Enterprise had given as good as she got, but the cost was immense. Hornet, her only ally, took multiple hits and was eventually abandoned, sinking beneath the waves that afternoon. Enterprise was now the only operational U.S. carrier left in the Pacific. That night, the ship was a floating hospital. Her decks were covered with makeshift stretchers. The smell of oil mixed with blood. Sailors moved silently, too exhausted to speak. Engineers welded through the night, patching steel with whatever they could find. Sheet metal, armor scraps, even wood planks. Hell would have been cooler. By 9 o'clock, the ship was bleeding. Dozens dead, dozens more missing. But she was still afloat, still launching planes. Above her, the air battle raged. Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, struck back. They found Shokaku and Zuikaku, hammering them with bomb after bomb. Shokaku took 3 direct hits, burning so fiercely she had to withdraw. Enterprise had given as good as she got, but the cost was immense. Hornet, her only ally, took multiple hits and was eventually abandoned, sinking beneath the waves that afternoon. Enterprise was now the only operational U.S. carrier left in the Pacific. That night, the ship was a floating hospital. Her decks were covered with makeshift stretchers, the smell of oil mixed with blood. Sailors moved silently, too exhausted to speak. Engineers welded through the night, patching steel with whatever they could find. Sheet metal, armor scraps, even wood planks. In the wardroom, the surviving officers gathered. The faces were hollow, eyes red from smoke and grief. Captain Hardison stood quietly. He didn't talk about medals or victory. He only said, "Tomorrow we repair. The next day we fight again." And they did. Within weeks, Enterprise was patched, rearmed, and sent back into the fray. The Japanese radio reports declared her sunk 3 times. They began calling her the ship that wouldn't die. To the men who fought her, she was more than a carrier now. She was a ghost, a symbol, an omen. Whenever the Japanese spotted her outline, panic rippled through the fleet. The gray ghost had returned. But Santa Cruz was not the end. It was the midpoint. The costliest lesson in the war's most vital transformation. Air power had replaced battleships as the true rulers of the sea. Enterprise had proven that carriers, not guns, dictated the outcome of modern warfare. By early 1943, with the Enterprise repaired again and again, the tide of war had begun to turn. The Americans no longer fought for survival. They fought for dominance. Her new pilots, young men barely out of training, carried the legacy of those who had fallen. They called themselves the Big E's boys. When she steamed back into the Pacific, she didn't just bring aircraft, she brought vengeance. Every bomb she dropped now carried the memory of Santa Cruz. Every plane she launched was an answer to Pearl Harbor. And yet, her greatest test was still to come. Because in 1945, as Japan's empire collapsed, a new kind of threat emerged from the sky, one that no armor, no gun, and no training could truly stop. Enterprise was about to face the kamikaze storm. It was April 11th, 1945. The USS Enterprise, weathered, scarred, patched together after 3 years of brutal combat, was off the coast of Okinawa. The sea was deceptively calm, the air thick with dread. Enterprise's radar room lit up with a dozen contacts, small, fast-moving dots. Not bombers this time, not fighters, kamikazes. The Japanese Air Force had turned desperation into a weapon. Hundreds of pilots willing to die for the Emperor, flying their planes directly into American ships. To them, this was divine sacrifice. To the sailors of Enterprise, it was pure horror. The ship's alarm screamed. Men scrambled to stations. Every gun, 20mm, 40mm, 5-inch, swung skyward. Smoke tracers clawed at the heavens. The first kamikaze came screaming in from the starboard bow, a Mitsubishi Zero diving almost vertically. He was hit once, twice, but kept coming. The plane struck the water just yards off the hull, exploding in a wall of spray and flame. The next one wasn't stopped. At 14:46, a Zero slammed directly into Enterprise's flight deck. The explosion tore through parked aircraft, ignited aviation fuel, and sent shrapnel across the ship. The carrier lurched violently. Flames reached higher than the mast. For hours, crews fought the inferno with hoses and sand. Pilots helped haul burning debris off the deck with bare hands. One witness recalled, "You couldn't tell where the men ended and the ship began. Everyone just moved, fast, silent, focused. By midnight, the fire was finally under control. Enterprise was crippled again, her flight deck ruined, dozens dead, scores wounded. But she still refused to die. Only 10 days later, Enterprise, the gray ghost, returned to battle. Her deck still scorched, her crew still exhausted. It was May 14th, 1945, the night before the final kamikaze wave struck Okinawa. Darkness covered the sea. Suddenly, radar picked up a lone plane, altitude 700 feet, speed 200 knots. Before anyone could react, it dove from the night sky. The explosion lit the deck in a blinding flash. A massive fireball consumed the forward section of the ship. Elevators were blown out, planes thrown into the sea. For a moment, the Enterprise fell silent, her lights gone, her systems dead. Men stumbled through smoke, feeling their way by memory. Electricians rerouted power through burned-out cables. Fire crews battled walls of flame. Hours passed before the fires were out. This was her 7th direct hit of the war. 7 times she had been declared beyond repair. 7 times she came back. But this one, this last strike, would finally send her home. By May 18th, the Enterprise was ordered back to Pearl Harbor for the final time. She limped into harbor, surrounded by tugs, her deck twisted and blackened. Sailors lined the rails, silent, proud, and broken. The war was ending, and the ship that had fought longer, harder, and closer than any other was finally done. When the Japanese surrender came in August 1945, the USS Enterprise, CV-6, had earned more battle stars, 20, than any other American warship. She had fought in every major carrier battle of the Pacific: Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. She launched over 20,000 combat sorties, shot down more than 900 enemy aircraft, and sank or crippled dozens of Japanese ships. Her air groups, nicknamed the Fighting Ladies' Fists, became legends. She had survived bombs, torpedoes, suicide planes, typhoons, and years of relentless combat. To the men of the Pacific Fleet, she was more than steel and engines. She was luck. She was memory. She was home. When Admiral Halsey was asked which ship he trusted most, he didn't hesitate. Enterprise. Always Enterprise. In 1946, she returned to the United States for the last time. Crowds gathered as she sailed into New York Harbor. Fireboats sprayed arcs of water. Bands played Anchors Aweigh. She had given everything. The Navy planned to preserve her as a museum. But post-war America had no money for sentiment. In 1958, the most decorated ship of World War II, the ship that had changed naval warfare forever, was scrapped. Her steel was melted down, her decks torn apart, her name removed from the registry. But her spirit did not die. Her memory lived on in the carriers that followed. In 1961, a new USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, was launched in her honor. And in 2017, the Navy announced another, USS Enterprise CVN-80, to carry her name into the 21st century. From World War II to the modern era, her legacy endures, an unbroken chain of steel, courage, and sacrifice. When the fires of Okinawa were finally out, Enterprise's decks were coated, not just in soot, but in the ashes of a generation. Out of nearly 2,200 men who served aboard her during the war, more than 400 never came home. Their names were etched into plaques, but their stories, quiet, unseen, became part of the ship's soul. The Pacific had swallowed countless carriers. Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, all gone. Enterprise had stood alone at times, carrying an entire nation's hopes, but the price was staggering. Pilots described flying missions, knowing the odds of return were 50-50. Deck crews worked 20-hour days under bombs and strafing fire. One sailor later said, "We didn't think of medals or victory. We just didn't want to be the ones who let her die." The USS Enterprise, CV-6, did more than win battles. She rewrote how the world understood naval warfare. Before 1941, battleships ruled the oceans. By 1945, that era was over. Enterprise had proven something revolutionary, that a flat deck of wood and steel, carrying aircraft, could decide wars faster and farther than any gun ever could. Every new U.S. carrier after her, from the Essex class to today's nuclear-powered supercarriers, carries design lessons born from her scars. Her engineers recorded every hit, every repair, every refit. They studied how fires spread, how fuel lines ruptured, how men fought back. Those findings shaped the modern Navy. Fire suppression systems became faster. Hull designs grew stronger. Elevators were reinforced. Bulkheads thickened. Hangars isolated with blast doors. Even the concept of redundant command centers, so a ship could still fight if her bridge was destroyed, came from Enterprise's experience at Santa Cruz. Every flame that burned on her deck made the next generation of carriers harder to kill. Yet, for all her achievements, America nearly forgot her. After the war, the public wanted peace, prosperity, not reminders of the terror they'd escaped. The Enterprise sat in Bayonne, New Jersey, stripped of guns and paint, waiting for a fate that no warrior deserved. Veterans tried to raise funds to preserve her as a memorial, a floating museum of courage. They wrote letters, held rallies, even offered to volunteer themselves for restoration work. But donations fell short. In 1958, she was sold for $566,000, the price of scrap steel. By March 1960, the great ship that survived every Japanese bomb was cut to pieces by American hands. One sailor who had served on her wept as the last section of hull fell. They couldn't sink her in war, but they killed her in peace. Her destruction became a national shame and a turning point. Historians, veterans, and journalists began to ask, how could we forget the ship that saved the Pacific? That question sparked the preservation movement for American warships. Because of her loss, others were saved. USS Intrepid in New York, USS Yorktown in South Carolina, USS Hornet in California, USS Lexington in Texas. Each one a museum now, each one carrying a part of Enterprise's legacy. Her death gave life to memory. The story of Enterprise is not just the story of a ship. It is the story of men who refused to surrender, even when logic said they should. Her damage control officer, Lieutenant Herschel Smith, never received a major decoration. Yet his leadership during the fires of 1942 and 1945 saved thousands of lives. Her captain, Arthur Hardison, who took her into battle half-repaired at Guadalcanal, would retire as vice admiral, but his bravery is still rarely mentioned in textbooks. Her air group commander, Wade McCluskey, whose instinct to follow a single destroyer at Midway changed the outcome of the war, died quietly in 1976, long after the headlines had moved on, and the thousands of sailors who manned her decks, electricians, mechanics, gunners, cooks, went home to ordinary lives. Factory workers, farmers, teachers, fathers. They carried the memory of the gray ghost with them, but most never spoke of it again. History may remember generals and admirals, but Enterprise was built on the hands of men who refused to quit. In 1961, the Navy commissioned a new USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in history. She carried the same name, the same crest, the same motto, Enterprise, ready to strike. This new Enterprise would serve for 51 years, through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and beyond. Her very existence was a tribute, a promise that the name Enterprise would never die again. And now, a new chapter begins. In 2028, another ship, USS Enterprise, CVN-80, will join the fleet, a Ford-class supercarrier, the most advanced warship ever built. Her crew will sail beneath the same name that once terrified Imperial Japan. They will walk the decks, knowing they inherit a ghost, a legend forged in the fires of the Pacific. Enterprise is more than a ship. She is a tradition of courage, reborn every generation. There are warships that serve, and then there are warships that define an era. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, was one of them. From the smoldering skies of Pearl Harbor to the typhoons of Okinawa, she carried the fight farther and longer than anyone thought possible. She wasn't the largest, nor the newest, but she was alive. Every rivet, every deck plate, every patch welded by her crew told a story of sacrifice, of endurance, of a belief that even in chaos, something unbreakable can endure. In every generation, nations build ships, machines of war meant to project power. But the Enterprise became something more, a symbol of what human determination can do when everything else falls apart. When the last of her crew passed away, they said she was still with them, in dreams, in memories, in the sound of engines echoing across the Pacific night. And maybe she is, because legends don't sink, they simply rise again, in new steel, new sailors, and new seas. That's the true story of the most dangerous American warship of World War II. The ship that refused to die. The ship that turned battles into massacres. If this story moved you, if you felt the spirit of the gray ghost, take a moment to keep her memory alive. Subscribe to the channel for more untold World War II stories that deserve to be remembered. Like this video so more people discover the real history behind the legends. Comment below where you're watching from, and tell us which battle, ship, or hero you'd like to see next. Because history doesn't live in museums, it lives in stories. And together, we'll keep telling them.